Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Students of the Word. This is session number 109, and today we get towards what we decided last time is actually the end of paragraph 18. Well, we're almost certainly not going to get to the very end of it, but we will begin looking at this set of 3 verses with which John winds up this long paragraph. So let's look ahead and look at the shape of this one more time. And then we'll focus in on that antepenultimate sentence in this paragraph. So back up to paragraph 18. Nope, that's 19. There we are. Okay. We had gotten through the sin towards death and the sin not towards death verses. Concluding with verse 17, all unrighteousness is sin, and there is a sin not leading to death. There's a sin not towards death. And you'll remember that I was feeling much more confident last time that the sin pros thanatos, the sin towards death, is not keeping the commandment, like hating your brother, not believing in the name of his son, Jesus Christ. Those are the two things that are the commandments, and not keeping those commandments. Again, we were looking back at previous examples where he was talking about how the one who hates his brother abides in death. That seems to be the pros thanatos sort of thing that's going on there. And that I think when he's clarifying, as very specifically in 17, he's clarifying there is a sin that doesn't lead to death. There is a sin other than that. There is the not keeping the commandment. There is not entering in at all. Or those, like back in paragraph 7, those who had feigned to enter in but haven't entered in, who went out from us, that it may be made manifest that they were not of us, as we may recall from paragraph 7. But so that is whereas mere unrighteousness, doing things wrong, messing up our relationship with God in some way, that's sin. But that is a sin that is not pros thanatos, that doesn't make you abide in death. That is a sin that can be cleansed and washed away by the blood of Jesus, as we were looking back, as John was talking about way back in paragraph 2, and alluding to again, it seems, in paragraph 3. So that he's trying to make a distinguishing between these two things, between those who are ektupanero, who are from the evil one, those who are false prophets, those who are antichristoi. There's a whole bunch of words and terms that he has used. And it seems to come down to the commandments, to not keeping the commandments. And, but he seems here to be clarifying, don't be anxious. Don't be anxious in the way that so many modern Christians are anxious when they read First John, right? When he says things like, he who is born of God does not sin. He's talking there, I believe, about this sin, the hamartia pros thanatos, the sin towards death. There is sin, and that there is a sin that is not pros thanatos. So look how in verse 18, he comes back to that. We know that no one who is born of God sins. So let's look, okay. Oidamen, we have seen that pas ho gegenemenos, that each of the having been born of God ones does not sin. But the having been begotten of God one, terei auton, keeps him. And hopaneros, kai hopaneros, and the evil one, uk haptitai autu, does not touch him. Now, we talked about touch before when we were reading through this earlier on. We talked about that word haptatai, which means touch and seems to be it's from that verb that means like grab, but it's like the mild version of grab. It seems to be like not only does the evil one not have hold of him, but he can't even touch him. That's what I recall us concluding when we were looking at that before. Before we get to terei, which is, for me, the most fascinating word in this whole sentence, let's pause for a moment to look at those verb tenses, because we have having been born or having been begotten, and we see, like, it's not at all clear to me which version of that he means or what kind of difference he's making between being born and being begotten. It's just, from the usage, it just does not seem at all obvious to me that he's not like playing with both meanings there. Everyone having been born of God. And our tense here is perfect. So what is it here? I'm going to make sure I'm getting this right. Perfect middle or passive participle. So each of the having been born ones, and it's singular, each having been born one. We know that each having been born of God one, having been born ectu theou, does not sin. But, strong reversal. But and this is, what is that? Aorist passive participle? Whoa. So the aorist passive participle. So the having been begotten is the passive part. The having been begotten ectu theou one. And with the aorist thing, that means it's referring to that particular moment, right? So if the perfect is referring to the state of being, right? We know that each of the having been born ones, right? So each of the ones who are in the state of having been born, right? But the aorist participle refers back to the event. But each person who at that time in the past has had this happen to them, which is having been begotten. So on the one hand, it sounds like he's talking about the same people, right? Each of the having been begotten ones, and the having been begotten of God one. Like when you say it in English, they sound perfectly identical, but they're not perfectly identical. The first one is perfect. The second one is aorist. So again, referring to being in the state of having been born, and the second time referring to having had this thing happen to you at some point in the past. And so the similarity between those two things makes it almost sound like one of those Hebrew poetry kind of things where he's repeating the same thing, right? He says a thing twice in a row in sort of different terms, except he has but in between, Allah, which suggests that there's some kind of actual reversal between the ideas. And I think that the thing that's being reversed is the idea of sinning. Each of the having been born of each person who is in the state of having been born of God doesn't sin. And that's just present indicative active. The hamertenai one, the sinning one, does not sin. It's not a thing they do. But like rather, instead, the having been begotten of God one, the one whom God begot back then, what does he do instead of sinning? He terei, present indicative active. That's what he does. He doesn't hamartanai, he terei. He keeps auton, him. He keeps him, guards him. And as a writer on that thought, hopeneros uch haptitai autu, and the evil one doesn't touch him. And again, notice that's present indicative as well. That's middle because that's the haptitai thing that we talked about. That's why it's touch instead of grab. Yeah. But it's present indicative, just like protects and sins, just like guards and sins. He does not sin, the having been born of God one. But the having been begotten, having been born of God one keeps him. Again, that's with Allah. That's what he does instead of sinning. And the evil one does not touch him. Which sounds like, first of all, remember the association between sin and the evil one that we got way back in paragraph 9. That is, the evil one does not touch him and he does not sin, seem like also two different ways of saying a very similar thing. That is, I think that last phrase, and the evil one does not touch him, is a strong way of emphasizing the not sinning that happens on account of the having been begotten one keeping himself, terei auton. Which is why that verb, that seems to me the center of the entire sentence, the fulcrum of this entire statement. He brings up the fact that we know that the having been born one, each having been born one, all of that, each having been born one, right, doesn't sin. So it doesn't sin at the beginning, and the evil one does not touch him at the end, which are, if not synonymous, they're close echoes of each other, right? And the heart of it is in the middle. So, we have this sort of, it has this 3-part symmetrical structure. But the having been begotten of God one, the having been born of God one, keeps him instead of sinning. So what does that mean? Terei. Now, I've said that terei, I think, is the really important word, because that's a very conspicuous word. We have seen him use this word before. And of course, what he uses this word for is the commandments, to keep the commandments. And that word terei means to keep in the sense of to protect, to guard, to stand watch over, is the metaphor there. And you'll remember weeks ago, months ago, whenever it was ago, when we were talking about that, I spent a lot of time wrestling with this word terei in that context. That is, in the context of it being the verb that you do to the commandment. And I was having a really hard time making sense of it. Why would you guard a commandment? It just seemed, when we were talking about it before, it seemed like a strange metaphor to use. But I have a theory as to why he uses that word. And that is, this is the same metaphor. It's not the same word, because so there's another word, philoso, which is very similar to terei in its meaning. Like, it means to guard or stand watch over. So it's a different word, but it's the same metaphor. that is used in the Greek Septuagint in Exodus 19. That is when God says to the people on Mount Sinai, or from Mount Sinai, right? When God says that they should keep the commandments, that they should keep the covenant that he is making with them. This is the metaphor that is used back then in Exodus. This is covenant vocabulary. And so my theory is that John uses the verb terai. He uses this metaphor of keeping or guarding because, like, of course he would. Because this is the kind of language that was used by the Jews to describe their relationship to the covenant. When God established the covenant, he told them to keep it. Now, again, it's still an interesting metaphor, right? But I think it also helps me to understand this particular usage. It was this that kind of threw me over the top in kind of understanding this. That is, because here he's not talking about protecting or keeping or guarding the commandments. Here he's talking about keeping or guarding or protecting yourselves. And that, it seems to me, is exactly the tone of this metaphor in the Old Testament when they talk about the covenant. They talk about keeping the covenant. That's the metaphor. Keep the covenant. But of course, the tenor of this throughout the Torah, throughout the prophets, is that what it means to keep the covenant is to keep yourself. It's often observed in the prophets that it's not God's failing that the covenant was let down, right? God kept his part of the covenant. God was faithful to the covenant that he made with his people. They were not always faithful to that covenant. Again, from fairly early on, right? The whole golden calf incident. But anyway, the idea that to keep the covenant, to hold to the covenant that God has made, when they swear their vows, which they do right there in Exodus 19:20, right when it's happening, when they make their vows to God, God's going to see to his part of it. They are promising to guard themselves, to follow, to keep the commandments of God. What does God immediately do when he announces that he is establishing his covenant with his people? He starts giving commandments, right? He starts speaking the 10 words, as they're called, right? And the rest of the Torah, the teachings, the instructions come afterwards. And these are things that people are supposed to keep. The 10 commandments are commandments. They're supposed to keep. They're supposed to guard them. They're literally given copies to terai, to phulasso, to guard. They put them in the Ark of the Covenant. They build the Ark of the Covenant first, then they put them in it, right? The second version, right, after Moses breaks the first ones. But and that's what that's for. Like, when you make a covenant, it gets written down and both sides get a copy, right? Because they're supposed to keep to their word. They're supposed to keep to their agreement. They're supposed to guard themselves. And of course, like symbolically, at least, you guard the like stone tablet upon which it was carved, as indeed the Israelites did, bringing the tablets around with them in the Ark of the Covenant, in the tabernacle. So when I think about keeping terai, the commandments, it starts to sound exactly like very noticeably familiar language as soon as I make that connection, as soon as I realize. And of course, like I didn't think of it right away. I didn't think of Exodus 19 and 20 right away when I was thinking before about keeping the commandments, about guarding the commandments. But then again, I'm not a first century Jew either, right? And I kind of have to think that anybody who is raised in that tradition at that time and took it at all seriously, all of things which seem to be quite true of John, um, that this is like this connection that I am making here between how John describes keeping the commandments and how the Old Testament describes keeping the covenant with God, the Israelites keeping the covenant. I mean, I think that that connection would probably be so obvious to John that he wouldn't have ever felt that he needed to explain it more. Um, the parallel that he's establishing between keeping the covenant, keeping the commandments, and keeping the covenant, I think is pretty clear. And think also about what this means. Think about how that maps onto the stuff we were just talking about the sin prosthenitos and stuff, right? Like the ones committing the sin towards death are the ones who are not keeping the commandments. The ones who, and what happens? What happens to Israel when it doesn't keep the covenant? It's cut off, right? God's preserves a remnant, right? But I mean, God describes consequences that come from this. Um, and all of the all of that language about them being of us, but then not of us, and then they went out from us, um, and making manifest that they were not of us. Again, like just when you think about this in covenantal terms, it starts to sound really familiar, right? Now all of a sudden, the antichristoi, the false prophets, start to sound like the followers of Korah in the book of Numbers. Right, these other rebels who separated themselves. Um, but yeah, and Stephen, I agree with all of the other Old Testament references that John's already made. Um, Even those in his audience who are not themselves Jews, he has given them enough clues, right, to get them thinking in that direction, for sure, for sure. Um, so so the more I've thought about it, the more obvious this parallel, the parallel that is suggested by the metaphor, protect, keep, guard in with Terai. But then again, it seems to be made almost more explicit here in this verse. The having been begotten of God one keeps himself, watches over himself. That is, keeps himself in the covenant, keeps himself in the commandments. And when he does that, that is to say, when he does that, when he keeps himself, when he stays inside the commandments, when he maintains that relationship with God, when he keeps loving his brothers and believing in the name of Jesus, then he's not committing the sin prosthenitos. Then he has the life of the age, not death. Then the evil one doesn't touch him. He doesn't sin. The evil one doesn't touch him. So to keep the commandments and to keep yourself are the same thing. That's what it means to keep the commandment, is to keep yourself, to abide, to remain in God, and God remain in you, and therefore have the life of the age. And again, the parallels to keeping the covenant and receiving the blessing of God, and that relationship between God and his people that he promises if they will keep the covenant that is promised to return. I think that, again, the parallel feels really clear when we think about that more. So I was I was really excited to when I realized that. Though it was one of those like kind of smack yourself in the head moments and be like, well, yeah, why didn't I think of that sooner? But there it is. Um, Notice how, by the way, even the language, if you're a God calls Israel his son, right? That the the Jews are God's children. That's a metaphor used frequently of them. Israel is his firstborn. And even the language, even the begetting and being born language here calls that to mind. But notice that this is not just a recollection. I think that's really important. This is not merely saying, yeah, so we know the covenantal promises that God made to Israel. He's making the same promises to us now. This is the same relationship. This is a parallel relationship. He's not just saying that, I don't think. That is, he's invoking the parallel. But, and this is where we get back, Scott, to the conversation we were having at the end of last time about the age. The age to be anticipated. The age predicted by Ezekiel, glimpsed by Isaiah. The age is the age when God comes back to earth, when heaven and earth are one again, when we are living the garden life again, when we have access to the tree of life, as again Ezekiel shows. This is the same vision, of course, Ezekiel's vision that John is redoing in Revelation. And what is connected with all of that? The promise. John is not just saying we can have a relationship like the covenant. The covenant itself was a foretaste of what was to come. And John is saying that which is to come is here. The life of the age, that future age, when God shall come down or when heaven and earth shall come together. Paradise regained, Jackie? Yes. It's here already. It's not everywhere. The age hasn't come, but it can come within us. We can have it in us. This having been born of God, this having been born of God in the aorist or in the perfect tense. These things, this is the beginning. This is where God's abiding in it. That's why he's talking about abiding all the time. God abides in us and we abide in him. That's the fulfillment. Those things that the prophets foresee, like Jeremiah when he's talking about that time when God will give people new hearts, right? Will take away their heart of stone and give them hearts made of flesh. Um, the tree of life, all that stuff. That life that is in Jesus, we have that life. That's what he was just saying in the previous paragraph. That's why he keeps talking about the Zoe, the agish Zoe, the life that is like, that has the quality of the age. And yeah, it seems to me that the primary difference between the basic Greek idiom, the agish, the age idiom that they use to mean something in indefinite or unending or ceaseless, it hits differently to Jews and even more differently to Messianic Jews because they believe, they are grounded in promises about the coming of that age, about the imminence of that age. And so, yeah, John's excited about the fact that the life of the age is here. The agish life is here. And that he's written this to us so that we may know that we have that life right now. Let's keep reading. I want to, I'm looking at we've got these three sentences. Notice that, so verse 18 was where I originally ended this paragraph. And I originally ended it because I could feel the beginning of the closing cadence. But the having been begotten of God one keeps himself, and the evil one does not touch him. And I think I was right. That does have the cadence of the end of the paragraph. But what I had overlooked is that he does it three times. And we have this parallel structure. Oidamen, we know that each of the having been born of God ones does not sin. But the having been born of God one keeps himself, and the evil one does not touch him. Yeah, so Susan, that's a really great question. Um, Susan says, I still don't see how it's himself. Yeah, Auton here. Um, it could be keeps him, in which case it would be God. So there are two options. He's either keeping himself or he's keeping God. On the one hand, I think himself seems more likely because, um, well, I mean, yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, yeah. So we talked about this briefly before, but let's get into this again. If it means him, if it's not talking about keeping himself, then it would mean keeping God. That's the only other antecedent. Theo is right there. And it was repeated twice. So there's only two nouns that are available to be the antecedent of auton here. One is the having been born one, and the other is God of whom he's been born. Randall says it's partly a manuscript thing. A lot of manuscripts actually have heoton, which would me himself. So the reflexive version is there in some manuscripts. Of course, Randall, one could ask, is that because himself makes more sense? And so it's a scribal correction later on when the later scribes were looking at this and were like, he means himself, right? Surely he's not keeping God. And so they shifted it. Yeah, Susan, you're thinking the same thing. That's what I mean, that is certainly fair to wonder. Um, it isn't always true that when there are two possible readings, like the harder, more difficult, more obscure reading is always the like authentic one. But it's like it's more likely that scribes are going to simplify than make things more complex. Yeah, exactly. Right. The more difficult reading, Randall, that's the more difficult reading argument, right? For that, um, that generally scribes don't make things harder; they make them easier. Um, but I agree, mistakes also happen that don't make sense. It's true. It's true. So that is hardly an inescapable argument. But let's think about it the other way. What if he does mean keep him, keep God? In what sense does that make sense? That terei, not God, Susan. Well, who else is there? Who else is around? I mean, in this sentence, we know that each singular of the having been born of God ones does not continue to sin, does not sin. But the having been begotten of God one keeps him. Well, right, but if it's the one having been begotten, then it is himself, because that's the subject of the verb. Like the having been begotten one is the subject of the verb terei here. It's the one doing the keeping. So if the him is not to be reflexive, then it has to be God. It's the only other antecedent in the ballpark. Um, yeah, no, I don't think it could go back. All adikia is sin, and there is sin that's not prostheneton. So yeah, I don't think we have any other uh, antecedents floating around, even if we go way back. So yeah, it has to be either himself or God. I can't make much sense of God as the object of their keeping or guarding. Again, the commandments makes perfect sense. Himself makes perfect sense. Both of those things fit with the overall. And again, I think that the parallel to the covenant with the commandments previously, which he's already done a couple times prior to this. So yes, I mean, I know I totally hear the argument that auton is not the reflexive pronoun, so it doesn't sound like that. As you said, Susan, the grammar does not suggest that it's reflexive. But I have to admit that I can see the dilemma of the scribes who are thinking either it's God that they're guarding, which doesn't make sense at all, or it's themselves. So it either doesn't make much sense or it, you know, is being used in a reflexive sense, even though he didn't use the reflexive pronoun. Um, yeah. Yeah, I'm trying to see any other way around that because I was thinking the same thing when we first read it a couple of weeks back. But I can't th if it doesn't have that reflexive sense. Well, let me try harder. Could it be God? Okay. All right. I hang on a second, Susan. I think what you're suggesting is the other one. So the one having been begotten in the aorist tense is the one doing the guarding here. Okay. But you're suggesting that it might be each of the having been born ones. Right. Right. Um, okay. Hang on. That would follow from what came before. I have a hard time with it. It's super awkward, but it would parallel what he was saying up here about the sinning brother, right? If anyone should see the brother of him sinning a sin not unto death, he shall ask, and he will give life. So one having been begotten of God, one is in that sense of the previous verse, guarding somebody else who's having been born of God. That's the asking for, that's the praying for them. Okay. Okay. I also can't help but notice this. Uh, when I am thinking about this awkward pronoun, auton, that we're wrestling with right now, and Susan, go back to the other passage that I think you're referring to, I'm reminded that we had an awkward pronoun there too. Remember? If one should see the brother of him, autu, sinning a sin not prostheneton, he shall ask in the future, and he will give. Remember, this is the thing. Ask and give him life to those sinning not unto death. Remember the asking give issue? Where it's like pretty, I mean, from context, it seems almost mandatory that the person is asking and God is giving. Surely nobody but God can possibly give life. And yet, the parallel of those two verbs, atesei kai dosei, auto, and that auto, there's our awkward pronoun number two, or number one chronologically, I guess. That's our other awkward pronoun, right? He will give to him life to those sinning. Like whom is God giving, to the brother or to the asker? But it's the atesei kai dosei. that remember was throwing me because, and remember all these extra commas that they're adding to try to make it clear, right? Which though it's just editorial, right? They're trying to help, but they're doing interpretation with those commas. He shall ask and he will give him there is dative. Give to him life. Dative again to those sinning, to the sinning one, to the sinning not unto death one. Right? That's what the DMP, yeah, dative masculine. Yeah, dative plural. So he's giving life. So I think here the him is parallel to tois hamartanusin, to the sinning ones. It will give him life to the not sinning prosthenaton ones. It is plural, I know. I'm seeing that, Susan, but I think that that sounds like he's kind of expanding there. I mean, remember this was although he was writing in the singular all the way through, he was also writing in the theoretical, right? If one should see the brother singular of him singular, he singular shall ask, and he singular, probably God, will give him singular life to those sinning not unto death, plural. So that the latter seems to be like an expansion of the idea. Like this, and this applies, this theoretical situation will play out whenever that person is in this category, right? Yeah, exactly. An elaboration of it. To those sinning not unto death. So we start with the singular theoretical and then the plural, like principle, right? Okay, back to 18 then. Okay, okay. So, Susan, if you were right, and this is, I mean, this is an interesting reading. This is, I'm warming up to this more and more. If you're right, then our two tense verbs, which are almost the same, genethes and gegenemenos, are talking about two different people. Each of the people in the state of having been born ektutheu doesn't sin. But the one who was born of God keeps him. Right now, Randall was pointing out in Vincent's commentary. I don't know who Vincent is, but I trust that he's more knowledgeable than I. That's a low bar. Um, Vincent notes that some people understand the aorist one to refer to Christ. Yes. Yeah. Martin Vincent. There we go. And in Vincent's commentary, the differentiation that he makes here is that the aorist having been begotten of God one is Jesus. And the each of the having been begotten of God ones in the perfect tense are believers. So those are the people. Each of those people who are in that state, they don't sin, but the having been begotten of God, and clearly our interlinear people are nudging us gently in that direction too, Randall? With their capital O1 here. Um, yes. Okay. I do remember when we came across this before, the having been begotten in the aorist, that we were thinking earlier on that it sounded like it was talking about Jesus, referring to the specific. I think they're leaning in that direction to Stephen with the interlinear translating the word begotten the second time and born the first time. That seems to me a false distinction. Just because, I mean, it's the point is he's making the parallel between the two things, right? Like Jesus was begotten of God, we are begotten of God. We're begotten of God because Jesus was begotten of God. Like we are in the state of having been begotten of God because Jesus was begotten of God. I don't think he's trying to differentiate that. I think he's trying to to connect those two things. Um, but but I could buy that. That the heiress having been begotten one is the one who's keeping each of the having been born of God ones. Which, by the way, just sounds like the covenant again from the different angle, doesn't it? We keep the covenant, we keep the commandments, and God keeps us. Right. Okay. This leads me into another problem, but we'll get to that. It's covenant all the way down, Susan, just as you say. Yes. So if the having been begotten of God one is Jesus, then Jesus is protecting the person singular because each of the having been born of God ones is singular, so that makes sense. Okay, but here's my new problem now. If we go with that reading, and of course that would explain why the evil one doesn't touch him. If Jesus is keeping him, then the evil one is going to touch him. Sure. After all, you know, Jesus is pulling apart the works of the evil one, right? From paragraph 9. Anyway, okay, here's my problem. My problem is but. I had been understanding but before as an opposition between the two verbs. When I was thinking that the subjects were basically the same, being talked about in a different way, each of the having been born of God ones does not continue to sin, but the having been born of God ones keeps. I was understanding Allah to be primarily opposing the two verbs. Not sin, but keep. However, if the two subjects aren't the same, then it seems harder for me to understand. I guess then I guess it's not that hard. That Jesus keeping him, the action of the one is still opposed to the action of the other, the theoretical the action of the other, the negative action, the not sinning. It suggests, the but in that case suggests almost a causal relationship. We know that each of the having been born of God ones doesn't sin. Why not? Well, because the having been begotten of God one keeps him. That's why. Right? But rather, or but instead, yes, exactly. This does not happen because this happens instead. Yeah, yeah. Okay. So, Susan, if you're right, and this reading is growing on me, I like it because I was uncomfortable with the outcome. I remember being uncomfortable the first time I read it. But I love a reading that makes sense of the whole thing without leaving loose ends. But um, if that happens, if that's the reading, then that means that this is expressing God's part of the covenant. God keeping the one who keeps the covenant. If you keep the commandments, then you are in that state of having been born of God. That's what that means. And you're not going to continue to sin, but rather, the Son of God keeps him, and the evil one can't touch him. So again, it's talking covenant all the way down, Susan, just as you said. So um, this is right from the sin prostheneton and the sin prostheneton, not towards death. If you're not committing the sin towards death, that is to say, if you're keeping the covenant, you still screw up, but you're keeping the commandments. If you're still in the covenant with God, God's still going to be in the covenant with you. And I think this is what then he is meaning when he says he does not sin. He goes back to paragraph 9 language, having just clarified that there's a sin not towards death. And that there is sin. As he said way back in paragraph 2, unrighteousness, adikia, which he just said, which can be cleansed by the righteousness of Christ. Oh, well, that's kind of what teriai auton looks like, isn't it? How is it? What does God keeping, what does Christ keeping us look like? Well, maybe it looks like cleansing us in the blood of his righteousness, as he explained back in paragraph 2. Yeah. Yeah. And so, no, when we've been cleansed, when our adikia is cleansed by the blood of Christ, then the evil one doesn't touch us. Yeah. Yeah. And it gets, so that would all fit really well with the sin prosthenetos and the sin not prostheneta. Yeah. It's very end of Revelation, Jackie. Very end of Revelation, very end of Ezekiel. Yes. I think those are very much the kinds of things that he has on his mind, has had on his mind all the way through. Let's read ahead 19 and 20. We're not going to have time to discuss these at length. But let's look at the parallels. Oidamen. Oidamen hoti. Again, oidamen hoti. We know that. So we knew before. We just have been describing what we knew before. Now we're knowing something again. We have seen that. Ektutheu esmen. That we are of God. We are from God. And Kai ho cosmos, holos, the whole world, lies in the evil one. Whoa. We have seen that this day, we have seen day, hoti. So notice he changes up the cadence to indicate to us that this is in fact actually the last sentence of the paragraph. Oidamen hoti, oidamen hoti, oidamen de hoti. Yep. Beautiful cadence. We know now, or whatever, we'll look at day, that the Son, huios to Theou, the Son of God, heke, is come. Is come, present tense, and has given, perfect tense, to us understanding. So that we may know, ginosko, not oidamen, so that we may know tonoletheon, the truth, the true. It's an adjective? Weird. We know the true one. And we are in the true one, in the Son of him, Jesus Christ. Hutos estin, he is the true God and agish life. Ooh, that's a lot. I'm just trying to understand the structure of verse 20. We know that the Son of God is come and has given us understanding so that we may know him who is true. And we are in him who is true. Is this still what we're knowing? Man, this sentence is like Russian nesting dolls of knowledge. We know that we know this and that. Well, okay. It does sound like a benediction, Susan. And I don't remember coming across Kitai before, Randall. Ooh, okay. Man, that last sentence. He is the true God and the agish life. It strikes me as odd. Odd. Uh, what I mean when I say it strikes me as odd is that it feels weird to assert that at this point. He is the true God. He is truth, he said before. Elephenos theos is giving me problems. True God, in what sense? True God, as opposed to false gods? But have we been talking about false gods? Well, you're right, Susan. We're just about to transition towards false gods, arguably. in our very brief paragraph 19 when we talk about idols. But okay, I mean, I get too far ahead of myself. So 19 is this relatively simple restatement of an idea that we've come across many times. The conflict between God and the world. We are of God. Others are, there's ectu theou and ectu cosmo. Remember that was back from paragraph 12, the false prophets paragraph that was all over there. We know the world hated, didn't know Jesus. We know that the world hated, is going to hate us. We've had all these warnings about the world. The whole world, ketai en to panero, lies in the evil one. Let's go ahead. We got a few minutes. Go ahead and look this up. Okay. Oh, by the way, I want to draw attention to something I've been doing. Did I talk about this before? About why I never read why I never look at the definitions of words when I look them up? Um, I always do this. I've just been like, whenever I go click on these words, like I never pay a lick of attention to what it, all this work that's been done over here. Um, and I just look over on the right, my right hand column, the concordance entries. And the reason I do that is that all of this is interpretive. Like by definition, it's all interpretive. Like definitions are interpretive. It drives you nuts when I do that. Yeah. Well, so the reason I do this, so I've had I remember the moment I was in grad school. Um, and I was studying 18th century English literature. And I got to Samuel Johnson and the writing of the first English dictionary. And studying Johnson's dictionary and his methods helped me to understand, to see for the first time, that all dictionaries are fundamentally interpretive. That, like, I loved dictionaries. And I remember always as a kid going to dictionaries to be like, tell me what this word means. And I would accept it. Like whatever the dictionary said, I would accept as if it were like, you know, spoken by the Lord. Like it's as if like a dictionary just is some kind of objective truth in some kind, in some sense, right? And I, I had this sort of like mind-blowing moment when I was in graduate school when I realized that dictionaries are just written by people. That when somebody writes a definition, when somebody defines a word in a dictionary, like it's a person who did that. And they can be wrong. You can disagree with the dictionary because it's just a person who wrote it. And so in particular, I'm like twice as resistant to just accept the word of a foreign language dictionary when they just point me to an English word, and say this is what this English word is the equivalent of that Greek word. Because I'm like, no, it's not. It's totally not. It's totally not just the equivalent of that. Because that ignores any possibility of the like connotations and usage differences and different patterns. And so to me, um, the only way, the only thing that I'm interested in is not what the dictionary writers have. I mean, like, I'm a little bit interested in it, but I'm not very interested in it. And that's why I never read it first. And I don't generally pay all that much attention to it because what I want to see is how is it used? How is it used? And of course, like I know the rest of these New Testament passages, so I can generally remember. That's why I allude to them, like I allude to the stories, right? So here with this one, for instance, we go straight back. We start with our John the Baptist, our pros example of my favorite pros example of the axe being pros the root of the tree, right? Which I found so helpful. But here's the verb there. The is laid. So that's interesting. A city set on a hill in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Um, the place where he where he lay, where his body was. Matthew 28. This is talking about Jesus's tomb. Okay. All right. And now we got in Luke, wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. The baby as he lay in the manger. So one of the things that I noticed that's interesting about this word right away, um, this the usages here in Greek are spanning both of the difficult lie lay English. First, so of course, needless to say, I'm sure that all of you are very well aware of the difference between lie and lay, and you know, never make the mistake that 98% of our society currently makes, which is not understanding the difference between the transitive and intransitive forms of the verb. So a transitive verb, uh, it means it's a verb that has that takes a direct object or even needs a direct object. And the intransitive form is one that doesn't take a direct object. So when you lie down on the bed, there's no object to that. It's just a thing. You're just an action. You're lying, right? You're lying down. You can do it in a direction, which is down, but so it can take an adverb, but it doesn't take an object, right? But when you put a thing down, when you lay something on the table, then you're doing a thing to an object, right? So that's the difference in English between lie and lay. And this word, kemai, right? Kemai is the lemma, I guess. Kemai in Greek is sometimes transitive and sometimes intransitive. City set on a hill. That's transitive. You're setting the city on the hill. You're laying the axe. That's transitive. The place where the Lord lay, that's intransitive. Lay is past tense. This is, of course, the thing that really confuses everybody and why they use them wrong all the time. As he lay in the manger, intransitive. Ooh, this child is set for the. That's interesting. But that's a fascinating usage. Let's look at that one more. And Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, the mother of him, behold, Edu, behold, this one, Ketai, this one is set, is laid for ice. For? Really? Sounds like it's set into the falling and rising up of many in the Israel. And for a sign spoken anti-legomenon. Well, that's fun. Um, okay. This is a really interesting usage. Behold, this child is set. Is laid. So all the rest of them are to be put there. And this is clearly a being put there sort of thing, but it's a prophetic putting there, right? Yes, Stephen, you're exactly correct. Stephen's is summarizing my view of dictionaries. I cordially dislike dictionaries and all their definitions, and I always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect their subjectivity. Yeah, that's kind of my viewpoint. Um, okay. So Randall says chemi is used for the passive of tithemi, put, place, or set. Right. To be put, to be laid. Yes. Yes. Um, yeah. Keep in mind, I'm not saying dictionaries are all bad. I'm not saying that every dictionary entry, because it's just written by a person, is therefore wrong. Um, there's great wisdom in the writing in many of the people who write things in dictionaries. Uh, I just I want to see it myself. I, I want to see the overall pattern, not just the interpretive synopsis that someone else has given me. Maybe I'm just stubborn. Oh, here's John the Baptist again. Oh, to have goods laid up for many years. Yes. Lane. This is a tomb in which no one had ever lain? Yeah. Let's look at John usages. Okay. Where they set six water pots there at the feast at Cana. Now there was set a vessel of vinegar next to the cross. Okay, near the cross where they took the vinegar. But it was set there. Somebody put it there. The linen wrappings were lying there in the tomb twice, three times. The body of Jesus had been lying. Okay. Those three very different translations of this make me want to see it more. Okay. Uh where what is that? Imperfect indicative. No way. Okay. Imperfect indicative middle or passive. Because but it's talking about the body, where the soma to Jesu, the body of Jesus was lying. Oh, interesting. So chemi is a verb that has no active form. Huh. Okay. So it has no active form, but it can be middle or passive. Hmm. Well, I don't understand that, but I mean, I'm just going to confuse myself more there, I think. But I can see how almost all of these have a passive sense. Had been set, had been laid. Even the tomb one, the virgin tomb one, right? That no body had ever been lain there. No one had ever lain there. It's still like been lain because they're dead. So they didn't lie themselves there. Um, okay. Really interesting. A veil lies over their heart in Second Corinthians. There's no foundation besides that which is laid besides that which is laid. Yeah. I am set. I am appointed for the defense of the gospel, says Paul in Philippians. That's the same kind of set. That's like the prophetic one that we got with where was it? Yes, Simeon. The child is set, is laid, put there for the fall, is appointed to, set up by God for that. He uses it, Paul uses that same sense in First Thessalonians. We are appointed thereunto, says the King James. Ooh, in Timothy, that's really interesting. The law is not made for a righteous person. It's not appointed. Same thing, not laid out for. Set down, yes. And then there's this one. Then we get a couple in Revelation. The city is laid out as a square, throne set in heaven. Okay. So the trends here, the clear trends, the thing, the subject of this verb is always a thing that is inactive. Like it's something being done to it. It's always passive. And the thing that's being described is generally a state of passivity. That is, it's sitting there, it's lying there. The prophetic usage is it's not just being inactive, like Paul saying he was set to do something, right? Just as the child is set to for the rise and fall of many. So child's gonna do something, right? Can do a bunch of things. And yet the emphasis in that verb is on the appointment, like is on it's still passive. He's gonna do these things because he was the object of the action. He was appointed. He was set to it. Yeah. Yeah. Susan, I know that by doing this, instead of just reading the definitions, I'm reinventing the wheel. But first of all, why should the writers of dictionaries have all the fun? But in addition, I don't know. It's just more helpful. I find it way more helpful. I find it gives me a much more sort of nuanced sense of, again, what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to translate. I don't want an equivalent English word because I don't think there is one. I want to understand the Greek word. And I can only understand the Greek word by seeing how it gets used. Um, yeah, as Stephen says, it's like working out a math problem again rather than just reading someone else's answer. Yeah, 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 exactly. Um, the whole world, the cosmos holos, ketai, is set, is lain in the evil one. Wow, that's much more interesting now. Because, of course, it's translated as if it were active. Lies in the evil one. But with the passive sense of that verb, is set, is laid. in the evil one. En to panero. Okay. Well, all right. I've indulged my fun with words here at the end. We'll come back to this. We'll come back to this for next time. Let's, we'll look at 19 again. And when we do next time, we should go back and look at some of the other Cosmos stuff so that we can see what he's sort of how he was building up to this. And then probably we'll move on and start tackling that really complicated thing that is verse 20. All right. Thanks, everybody. That was great fun. As we're working now in the anti-penultimate verse of the entire epistle, we're getting there. And coming towards the end of our penultimate paragraph. Thank you, guys. Really enjoyed learning with you again tonight. And I will see you again next time for verse 19 and maybe 20. Thanks very much. Bye now.